Most men do not fail because they are weak. They fail because they repeat phrases that quietly sabotage their own minds. These phrases sound harmless, even logical, yet they create anxiety, confusion, and a sense of being stuck without direction. Stoicism, along with hidden psychological insights, reveals that language is not communication alone, but programming. In the next few minutes, you will see how 7 common phrases are silently shaping your destiny, and how removing them can radically transform your entire life trajectory. There is a quiet mechanism operating beneath your awareness, and it does not care about your intentions, your plans, or your ambitions. It listens only to what you repeatedly say, especially in moments of frustration, doubt, and emotional fatigue. Words are not passive tools. They are active forces that structure perception, filter reality, and influence behavior in ways most people never question. A man can believe he is thinking freely, while in truth he is trapped inside a small loop of self-defeating language. He says certain phrases so often that they become invisible, like background noise. Over time, those phrases harden into assumptions, and those assumptions begin to dictate action. Eventually, his life reflects not his potential, but the limits of his vocabulary. Stoic philosophy understood something deeply unsettling about human nature. Thinkers like Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus taught that suffering is not caused directly by events, but by the interpretations we attach to them. This means that what you say about your life is more powerful than what actually happens in your life. The external world provides raw material, but your internal language shapes the final experience. Modern psychology, along with insights that could be described as Jungian in nature, points toward a similar truth. The unconscious mind absorbs repeated statements without resistance. It does not analyze whether a phrase is helpful or destructive. It simply accepts patterns. If a man consistently describes himself as unlucky, misunderstood, or incapable, his mind begins to organize reality around those ideas. This is where the danger becomes subtle. These phrases do not sound dramatic. They do not feel like declarations of failure. They often appear as excuses, jokes, or honest observations. Yet each time they are spoken, they reinforce a mental structure that limits growth. A man who says, "That's just how I am," unknowingly locks himself into a fixed identity. A man who repeats, "It's too late for me," slowly erases future possibilities from his awareness. These are not merely sentences. They are decisions disguised as thoughts. Over time, these patterns accumulate. They shape habits, influence relationships, and determine how opportunities are perceived or ignored. Life begins to narrow, not because the world has fewer options, but because the mind has reduced what it is willing to see. What makes this even more dangerous is that most men defend these phrases. They treat them as truth rather than interpretation. They build identity around limitation and then wonder why progress feels impossible. To understand this is to begin seeing the hidden architecture of your own mind. And once you see it clearly, you cannot unsee it. There is a moment that most men never notice, yet it quietly determines the direction of their entire lives. It happens between an event and a reaction, in that narrow space where interpretation forms. In that space, a phrase appears, often automatic, often unquestioned. That phrase feels like truth, but it is actually a choice that has been repeated so many times it no longer feels like one. Imagine a man facing failure. Outwardly, nothing unusual has happened. A plan did not work, an opportunity closed, a risk did not pay off. Yet internally, something far more significant takes place. He does not simply observe the failure, he labels it. He says, "This always happens to me," or "I knew I would mess this up." In that instant, he is no longer dealing with one event. He is reinforcing a pattern that stretches into his past and projects into his future. This is where the loop begins to tighten. The mind, especially the deeper layers described in Jungian psychology, does not separate language from identity. When a phrase is repeated enough, it becomes a lens. That lens filters perception so that new experiences appear to confirm the old statement. It feels like evidence, but it is actually alignment between belief and attention. Over time, this creates a closed system. The man expects certain outcomes, notices only what supports those expectations, and ignores anything that contradicts them. He begins to say, "See, I was right," without realizing he has been shaping the conditions that make it seem true. This is the quiet trap of self-sabotage. It does not look like destruction, it looks like consistency, it feels like realism. Yet beneath it, something more rigid is forming. Flexibility disappears, curiosity fades, possibility becomes narrower with each repeated phrase. Stoic thinkers warned about this, though they described it differently. They spoke about the danger of attaching judgments to events, about how quickly the mind adds unnecessary meaning. What they understood is that the first interpretation is rarely neutral. It is influenced by habit, emotion, and past conditioning. Here is where the tension deepens. If these phrases are automatic, how can a man ever escape them? If the mind keeps producing the same interpretations, does that mean he is trapped inside them? The unsettling answer is that most men never interrupt the loop. They live inside it, believing they are reacting to life, when in reality they are repeating a script. The script becomes familiar, and familiarity feels safe, even when it leads nowhere. But there is a hidden fracture point in this system. A single moment of awareness can expose the entire pattern. When a man notices the phrase as it forms, not after it has already shaped his reaction, something shifts. The loop hesitates. For the first time, there is space between stimulus and response, and in that space, something unexpected emerges. Not certainty, not immediate change, but a question that disrupts the entire structure. What if the phrase is not true? There is a hidden discipline within Stoicism that most people overlook. It is not only about enduring hardship or controlling emotions, it is about mastering the language that forms your internal reality. The Stoics understood that before a man conquers the world, he must first conquer the sentences he repeats to himself. These 7 phrases appear ordinary. Many men use them daily without hesitation. Yet each one carries a subtle distortion that reshapes perception, weakens agency, and slowly redirects the course of a life. The first phrase is, "That's just how I am." On the surface, it sounds like self-acceptance. In truth, it is a quiet resignation. It freezes identity and rejects growth before it even begins. A man who speaks this way is not describing himself, he is defining his limits and reinforcing them. Stoicism teaches that character is built through deliberate action, not declared through static labels. The second phrase is, "I'll start tomorrow." This is one of the most dangerous illusions because it feels responsible rather than destructive. It gives the appearance of planning, yet it delays action indefinitely. Tomorrow becomes a psychological escape, a place where effort is always scheduled but never executed. Over time, this phrase erodes trust in oneself, creating a gap between intention and reality. The third phrase is, "I can't help it." This is the language of surrendered control. It removes responsibility and places behavior outside the domain of choice. Whether it is anger, distraction, or fear, this phrase suggests that the man is a passive observer of his own actions. The Stoic perspective rejects this entirely. While external events are not always controllable, responses always are. The fourth phrase is, "It's too late for me." This sentence quietly closes the future. It compresses time into a fixed narrative where change is no longer possible. Yet this belief is rarely based on objective reality. It is based on comparison, regret, and imagined deadlines. A man who adopts this phrase stops looking for opportunities, not because they are absent, but because he has decided they no longer apply to him. The fifth phrase is, "People like me don't succeed." This is where identity merges with limitation. It introduces a generalized belief that turns individual experience into a permanent rule. The mind begins to filter out evidence of possibility, focusing only on confirmation of failure. In Jungian terms, this reflects an unconscious alignment with a diminished self-image, one that seeks consistency even at the cost of growth. The sixth phrase is, "It's not worth the effort." This phrase disguises fear as rational judgment. It often appears when something meaningful requires risk, patience, or discomfort. By labeling the effort as unnecessary, the man protects himself from potential failure, but also from potential transformation. The Stoics viewed effort as a fundamental expression of virtue, not something to be evaluated solely by outcome. The seventh phrase is, "This always happens to me." This is the language of recurring victimhood. It takes isolated events and turns them into patterns of inevitability. The man begins to see himself as someone to whom negative outcomes are destined. This perception shapes behavior in subtle ways, reinforcing the very experiences he wishes to avoid. What connects all these phrases is not negativity alone, but finality. Each one closes a door. Each one reduces flexibility and replaces possibility with certainty. They create a rigid internal environment where change becomes increasingly difficult. The deeper insight is this. These phrases are not descriptions of reality. They are commands issued to the mind. Repeated often enough, they organize perception, influence decisions, and shape behavior until life begins to mirror the limitations they impose. Stoicism offers a counter-principle that is both simple and demanding. Do not accept impressions without examination. When a phrase arises, question it. When it feels true, test it. This is not about blind positivity. It is about precision. A man who replaces "I can't help it" with "I am choosing this response" immediately regains agency. A man who replaces "I'll start tomorrow" with a single action in the present interrupts the cycle of delay. These are small shifts, yet they alter the direction of behavior in measurable ways. Over time, this practice restructures the internal environment. Language becomes intentional rather than automatic. Identity becomes fluid rather than fixed. The mind begins to open where it once closed. The most important realization is not that these phrases exist, but that they operate quietly. They do not announce themselves as destructive. They feel normal. That is precisely why they are powerful. Once seen clearly, however, their influence begins to weaken. The man who becomes aware of his language gains access to a deeper level of control. Not control over external events, but over the interpretations that shape his experience of those events. And from that point forward, his life is no longer dictated by unconscious repetition, but guided by deliberate thought. At some point, this stops being theory and becomes uncomfortably personal. You begin to recognize these phrases not as abstract ideas, but as something you have said in your own mind during quiet moments. Maybe it was after a failure that felt heavier than expected, or during a period when motivation slowly disappeared without a clear reason. You might remember telling yourself that you would start tomorrow, fully believing it at the time. You might recall dismissing an opportunity because it felt pointless, or convincing yourself that certain outcomes simply were not meant for you. In those moments, nothing felt dramatic. There was no clear sense of self-sabotage. It felt reasonable, even honest. This is what makes it difficult to confront. These phrases often appear during times when energy is low and clarity is limited. They offer relief, a way to explain discomfort without having to challenge it. For a short time, they reduce pressure, but over longer periods, they quietly shape direction. If you look closely, you may notice patterns that repeat across different areas of life. The same type of hesitation appears in work, relationships, or personal goals. The context changes, but the underlying language remains similar. It becomes familiar, and familiarity creates a sense of identity. This is where many men begin to feel stuck without understanding why. Effort is made, intentions exist, but progress feels inconsistent or slow. The missing piece is often not effort, but awareness of the internal narrative guiding that effort. When you start observing your own language, something subtle begins to shift. You catch a phrase before it fully settles. You notice the tone behind it. Instead of accepting it immediately, you hesitate for a brief moment. That hesitation is small, but it changes everything. In that space, you begin to see that the phrase is not a fact. It is a perspective that can be examined, adjusted, or replaced. This realization does not instantly solve problems, but it creates a different relationship with them. You are no longer completely identified with the voice that limits you. You become the one who hears it. And once that separation appears even slightly, change stops feeling impossible and starts feeling available. There is no need for dramatic change or sudden transformation. What is required is attention, precise and consistent. Begin by listening to the phrases that arise when something does not go as planned. Notice how quickly the mind tries to label the situation, how easily it reaches for familiar explanations that feel automatic. Do not try to silence these phrases. That creates resistance. Instead, observe them as they form, as if you are hearing them from a slight distance. This shift alone begins to weaken their authority. The moment a phrase is seen clearly, it loses part of its power to define you. Then introduce a small interruption. Not a grand replacement, not forced positivity, but a simple adjustment that restores responsibility. Change "I can't help it" into "I am choosing this response." Change tomorrow into a single action taken now, no matter how small. This is how discipline begins, not through intensity, but through awareness applied repeatedly. Over time, your language becomes deliberate, your reactions become measured, and your life begins to reflect a mind that is no longer running on unconscious patterns, but on conscious direction. A man's life does not collapse in a single moment. It narrows slowly, shaped by the words he repeats when no one is listening. What feels like truth is often habit, reinforced over time until it becomes invisible. The moment he sees this clearly, something changes. Not the world, not the circumstances, but the way he meets them. Language becomes a tool instead of a trap. Thought becomes something he directs, not something that directs him. This is where freedom begins, quietly and without spectacle. Not in controlling everything, but in choosing what to accept as real. And in that choice, a different life starts to unfold.